In a new court filing, the Justice Department specified it wants to make public 5 days of grand jury testimony against Jeffrey Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell. This comes after two victims of Epstein's abuse condemned the DOJ's request to unseal that testimony. In emotional letters, the victims expressed frustration with the government's latest handling of the case. One of them writing, quote, "I am not some pawn in your political warfare." CNN's Caitlin Polance is in Washington. Caitlin, what more do we know about these court filings?
Well, Jessica, it's two victims who are writing to the judge now. They are both calling for the transparency of what is in the court files from the grand jury transcripts related to the Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell grand jury testimony, but they're also not happy with how the Justice Department has gone about asking for transparency here in court, something that is still going to be decided by the judge. These letters from two victims writing to one of the judges here overseeing the Epstein case, they are capturing frustration. They're capturing the sensitivity of this situation. They're capturing the effect of the political debate that just doesn't seem to want to end in any way over the transparency around the Jeff Epstein case. And they're also capturing just blatant anger here. I'll read a little bit more from one of those victim letters. "I come forward to you today in disdain, disgust, and fear of how the United States of America's Justice Department, DOJ, has handled the promise to release the Epstein files. I am not some pawn in your political warfare. What you have done and continue to do is eating at me day after day as you help to perpetuate this story indefinitely." That's a victim writing essentially to the United States of America. The Justice Department, however, Jessica, they are getting into more specifics with the judge, saying, we do want you to release files. We want you to redact names of victims that would not be public. And we also want to remind you that much of this in the Epstein files is already public, at least what is captured in 5 grand jury transcripts from 2 days in 2019, 2 days in 2020, and 1 day in 2021. The Justice Department says that much of what was captured in those grand jury sessions secretly that they're now asking to have released, it was already made public at trial or it's been discussed publicly in other venues. That, too, is something that is causing frustration among the victims. There's the other victim letter writing that the highest priority here does not seem to be about the victims. It seems to be about protecting people who are not the victims, high-profile people, high-profile men. This victim even mentioning our own president, whose name apparently appears in these filings. And that second victim is calling for the judge to have a third party go through these documents, redact victims' names, and then make a decision or help make a decision on what else should be released. Jessica?
Yeah, it is certain that these victims have suffered tremendously. Caitlin, thank you so much for that reporting. We appreciate it. The Justice Department says it wants to make public 5 days of grand jury testimony against Jeffrey Epstein and his associate Ghislaine Maxwell. This after two of the victims of Epstein voiced deep concern over the Trump administration's request to unseal that testimony. Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Elise Adamson. Elise, thanks so much for being here with us. Start first with this. How likely is the judge to do what the DOJ is asking? And in the grand scheme of things, how rare is it for a judge to do what the DOJ is asking?
Yes, Jessica, it's hard to predict just for the very reason that this request is very rare. This is an unusual, and I may even say extraordinary request to unseal these grand jury transcripts. And the reason I say this is because this is still an active case. We should not forget that Maxwell still has an active appeal, which she's now bringing all the way up to the Supreme Court to have her conviction reversed. So that means ultimately her case could even go back to trial. Judges would be hesitant under those circumstances to release grand jury transcripts. I mean, look, as it is, there are limited circumstances in which grand jury transcripts are unsealed. In extraordinary circumstances, judges are inclined to deny the request for the prejudice to the defendant, the prejudice to the victims in this case, just the prejudice to the integrity of the court proceedings if they are still active. So while it is hard to predict, ultimately the judge may decide to release redacted, smaller excerpts of this grand jury transcripts. It's also very possible he'll flat out deny the request given all of the reasons that I just articulated.
And as they're evaluating this, we have already gotten some statements from some of the victims asking the judge to take special care in making sure their identities remain sealed, talking about how they feel like they are political pawns in all of this. How might those statements factor into the judge's decision here?
Look, Jessica, it's interesting because while the victims, and I think it's also significant that we heard from the victims, because for a case that is about victims, we have kind of lost their narrative in this entire Epstein file, really debacle for the Trump administration. And it's to their point that this has been politicized. It's become transparency rather than a case about victims. But the victims are not opposing the release of the transcripts. To the contrary, they're actually, one was calling for the release and full transparency in an effort to make this story come to an end. This has been in the news cycle for weeks. And so you can understand how victims in this case can feel re-victimized by this continuing conversation. So what the victims were saying in the letter to the judge wasn't, don't release the transcripts. It was, please let our lawyer comb through these transcripts and make sure that they remove any potentially identifying information so they can remain anonymous. So I think a judge is going to balance those concerns. And again, because they are not opposing it like Maxwell did, I think the judge is going to take that into account when rendering a decision.
All right, Elise Adamson, great to have you with us this morning. Thanks so much for that. CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Elliot Williams is joining us now. Good morning, Elliot. Good to have you here.
Morning.
Let's talk first with these victim statements. We are expecting more to be filed. Look, they obviously are expressing great pain, and they have said, look, if you're going to do this, let a third party, let our attorney go through and make sure that our names, we remain anonymous. How much does all of this play into how the judge is thinking about this?
To some extent, it will play into how the judge is thinking about it. But to be clear, Jess, grand jury materials are very rarely released, and the law is quite clear, and frankly, far clearer than it is in virtually any other area of American law as to what the rules are. Grand jury materials are really only ever released to other prosecutions or official business or to other grand juries. Now, there might be circumstances where public interest is so great that a court might allow it, but that's few and far between. You're talking, things that are 70 or 100 years old or Watergate-related matters, big, high-profile matters. This may not be it. Now, certainly a judge can consider things like victim statements, the statements of the parties, the defendant, and so on. But the notion that any grand jury release in any case is going to be straightforward or easy is just, we should get that out of our minds.
Yeah, I mean, that was my other question to you, more big picture, exactly what you're saying, which is this is a rare thing that any judge would agree to this to begin with. The DOJ has to know that.
The DOJ certainly does know that. And to be clear, the victims here are not asking for anything unreasonable. We would expect that even in the off chance that grand jury materials were ever released, that victim names would be redacted for their own protection. And quite frankly, the names of people who are accused of crimes or investigated but not charged with crimes would also be redacted too. It's any release of these prosecutorial materials would be heavily limited such that people were not unduly embarrassed by what they saw here. So the DOJ has to know this. They're still pushing forward, knowing full well that the law largely isn't on their side here, but you never know.
Fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing.